this video is going to be about how I got the Twincharged system working on the 55. Unfortunately, I still couldn't get a hold of an engine tuner to actually tune the engine for me, but everything else is working, so I decided to upload this video for now because the next video might take a while. And there was a bunch of electronics involved in how I got this working, and a lot of programming, so I'll show you guys how I did that. And a few other things. I've added a carbon fiber roof. That's because I had to add a roof scope on the back. The scope still isn't done, but I've done some temporary ducting work for now, just to guide air to the intercoolers. This middle part comes off, so while I was testing it, I just took this middle part of the roof off, so there can be some air going to the intercoolers. And yeah, the intake air temperatures with this setup are super cold. And I've also made a vent at the back. So that vent at the back is basically so that the air that will enter in from the roof scope going through that vent to the intercoolers, it will exit from the back. So far I've only been running the system at low boost because it's not tuned to take more boost right now. But the reason I was testing it is just to get everything working before the dyno tune. So when the car gets tuned, it's just going to be a matter of increasing the boost, and then the car will actually be able to make more power. So I'll start off by explaining how I got the Twincharged system working, the electronics and everything, and then later get on to all the other things. So just to quickly explain how the Twincharged setup actually works, I've just drawn a diagram over here of what my induction system looks like right now. So these are the two throttle bodies that I have behind the passenger seat and an air filter over here. And all this is in the engine compartment: the throttle body, the supercharger, the intercooler, water to air intercooler, the engine over here, and this is the surge tank, and a recirculating valve that's located right underneath the supercharger. And these are the turbos that are in the trunk and three intercoolers that the turbos feed into. So the way the system works right now is that when the car is in supercharged mode, this valve remains open, like this, and this valve remains closed. So the air comes in from this air filter, it goes through this pipe over here, through the throttle body, through the supercharger. The supercharger also has a clutch, so when the clutch is on and the recirculating valve is closed, that's when the supercharger is on. So then the air will basically go through the supercharger, through the screws, and it will be compressed. And then it goes through this intercooler. It's a water to air intercooler that cools the air down, and then it goes into the engine. And what the supercharger helps do is, because it's compressing air and it's putting compressed air into the engine, that also means that the engine will blow more exhaust, because if you're feeding more air into the engine and it's combusting that air, obviously you'll get more exhaust as well. So all that extra exhaust that's coming out of the engine, that helps spool the turbos up faster. When the turbos do spool up and they reach their maximum pressure, right now you can see that this valve is closed, so the turbos are doing nothing at all. They're just compressing air in this section over here. And there's a pressure sensor that I have right here. What that pressure sensor does is, when it detects that turbos are spooled up and they've reached the pressure, whatever the pressure I set it to, then the system will know that the turbos are ready. What it will then do is it will open this recirculating valve. And when this recirculating valve opens, that basically means that all the pressure that supercharger is making will be lost. It will just go back into this section of the pipe over here. So basically the recirculating valve is like a bypass valve, but for the supercharger. There's another pressure sensor that I have right at the surge tank, and when this pressure sensor detects that the pressure at the surge tank has actually fell to zero, meaning that the supercharger has disconnected, that's when it closes this valve and it opens this valve. So then the extra pressure from the turbos would basically be boosting the engine rather than the supercharger. So here's a quick video to show you the transition from supercharger to turbocharger on this temporary gauge that I had mounted. So for controlling everything, I was using this circuit mounted at the back. This was a circuit I designed a while back. It's based on two Atmel microcontrollers, but it was designed originally to control a robotic arm with 2 amp motors. The problem I ran into with this circuit was that the transistors on this circuit were the heat sinking on them was only appropriate for controlling 2 amp motors. But the throttle bodies that I had, when they would stall, they would go up to 6 amps. So the heat sinking wasn't appropriate on this circuit. So what ended up happening was, initially when I tried controlling the throttle bodies with this, I ended up burning a few transistors. So obviously that meant I had to go with another solution. So the solution I came up with was to use relays, to make another circuit using relays and resistors to control the power going to the motors. So that wasn't the ideal solution, because with relays you don't really have the same control over the motor as you would with a transistor, because with the transistor you can actually have a much better control of the power and control the position much better. So what I was using the resistors was for limiting the power, and the relays were for the switching. Because with these motors, you can't run them on full power all the time, you will burn them out. So what I was doing was I would run them on full power just while I was switching, and right when the switching was done, they would shift to low power using the current limiting resistors. So the motors weren't being damaged or anything. So right now I just have the system programmed that whenever I flick the switch over here, it will switch the position of the valve, just to test everything. And this is how fast the valves are actually going to switch. Once I had the valves working, the next thing I had to do was take control of the supercharger clutch and also the supercharger recirculating valve. Because with this setup I would have to control the supercharger myself using my circuit rather than the engine ECU controlling the supercharger, because there is no communication between that circuit and the ECU from the engine. So I needed one circuit to control everything, since the timing needs to match when the supercharger turns off and when the turbos turn on. So over here I was testing the operation of the recirculating valve that's underneath the supercharger. Next I tested the operation of the supercharger clutch. This was simple enough. You just give it 12 volts and the clutch engages, and you release 12 volts and the clutch disengages. The only thing I found with this was that when you give it the signal to disengage, it takes about half a second before the supercharger clutch actually disengages. That's why I was using the recirculating valve mostly to control the supercharger, turning it on and off, because using the clutch is a really slow way to control the supercharger. So after I had most of the outputs going from the controller figured, next I had to work on the inputs, so giving it the right pressure input so the controller knows what to do. So first I tapped into one of the surge tanks of the engine. So this is basically the part where the air goes from right before it enters the engine, so it gives you a really accurate reading of the pressure. And while I was at it, I also linked this to two pressure gauges that I temporarily connected for now, but later I'm thinking I might at least keep one of these gauges, because it is a good thing to know what pressure your system is running at. So I passed the same lines all the way back to these two pressure sensors that I had with the circuit, and one of those pressure sensors detects the pressure at the surge tank, and the other pressure sensor detects the pressure right after the intercoolers to sense when the turbos are spooled up, and also for regulating the pressure of the turbos. Later I also took an input from one of the injectors, and also the throttle position and also the brake pedal. So once I was done with connecting all the inputs and outputs, next I had to actually program the microcontroller to basically tell it what to do with those inputs and outputs. So I was using the software called Atmel Studio. Since I was using Atmel microcontrollers, the software is the thing that works best with these microcontrollers. And I was using the language C++ to actually program the microcontrollers. So it took a few attempts of changing the program and then actually testing the car and then changing the program again. I was using my friend to actually look at the gauges and look at all the values from the OBD2 ports to just make sure that everything was within a safe range, and like the system wasn't overboosting or anything like that. And then I had to basically go back and forth to change the program a little, test the car again, change the program a little, and I think it took me 4 tries to get everything perfectly done. Now, one of the benefits of controlling everything using electronics is that you can basically just change the program and change everything. You don't need to change physical things. So for example, this valve over here is also being used as the bypass valve for the turbocharger, because if you look at the system, there is no other bypass valve in the system, a mechanical bypass valve like you find in most turbocharged cars. So basically what I'm doing is I have this valve programmed as the bypass valve. So it basically takes pressure readings from the turbo and from the manifold, and it basically simulates this valve to act as a bypass valve. I also have it programmed as an overboost protection. So in case the pressure tries to go above what it's programmed for, this valve will open up and it will let all the extra pressure through, so it doesn't go to the engine. And you see this come in whenever the engine tries to change gears. So whenever it's going from high RPM to low RPM and it goes really fast, the system is actually programmed to decrease the boost in low RPM and increase the boost in high RPMs. So what it does is this valve will momentarily open, and you hear it chirping during gear shifts. So what it's doing is it's letting that extra pressure through, because obviously the wastegates can't react that quickly. Controlling the spool on the turbos using the wastegates is actually a really slow process. So this speeds it up. So that's one of the cool things that I can do. Another benefit of that is that I'm also using the same controller to control the wastegates on the turbos. So basically this pipe goes to a solenoid that's going to the controller. So basically the controller can actually control the level of boost the turbos are making. So that gives me the ability to change the boost level just by changing a program. And it also gives me the ability to vary the boost according to the RPM. So what I'm using that for is that as the engine revs higher and higher, I'm also increasing the boost because higher RPMs is where the engine starts struggling for air and it needs more air. Another cool thing I'm using it for is that when you're going full throttle and the throttle body is fully open, what the system does is it takes the pressure reading from this surge tank and it actually regulates the pressure in the actual surge tank rather than regulating the pressure at the turbos. So what that does is it gives you a really accurate control over the boost because you're literally controlling the pressure right before it enters the engine. So any restrictions in the throttle body, any restriction in the supercharger or in the intercooler core would not affect your boost level. So that also means that you can literally change the flutter on the bypass valves just by changing the program. So you can program it to flutter differently just by changing the pressure values that it responds to. But in the end, I programmed it not to flutter because the flutter, what it might do later on is that it might damage my relays because the relays are literally sparking on and off as the bypass valve flutters. That's why I've now programmed it not to flutter anymore. So once everything was done, I did take the car to the track, not to drive it fast, but just to test the system under actual track conditions. For the most part, the car ran okay, but there were some issues. The supercharger wasn't working, and one of the microcontrollers on the board was bad. It wouldn't function sometimes. So it's a good thing I figured that out. So I have that fixed now. So that's pretty much it for the Twincharged system. Now I'll show you how I made the carbon fiber parts, the roof and the vent at the back. So for making the vent at the back, this was easy enough. What I basically did was I just took these two aluminum sheets that I had. One was bent at a 90-degree angle and the other one was bent at a 45-degree angle. And I molded the carbon fiber around that. And then the carbon fiber that was bent at the 45-degree angle, I just cut it into this shape to make the vents. And then the 90-degree ones, I just used it to make the ends that would hold these different vents together. And then basically I just glued everything together and then I flipped it over and then that was basically the vent. For making the carbon fiber roof, that was a little more difficult than this. It wasn't actually a fully carbon fiber roof. This was a layer of fiberglass at the bottom and then foam in the middle and then carbon fiber at the top. So basically the roof has a foam core in it. That's what gives it a lot of strength. So to make this first, what I had to do was I had to cut the foam in the shape of the roof. But to do that, I just used this plastic sheet that I had. I just put the plastic sheet over the roof and marked the size I needed to cut it at. And then I put this over the foam so I could cut the foam to that shape. And then after this I started the molding process. I decided to mold the first layer, which was a fiberglass layer, over the existing roof of the car. So to start off, I wrapped my whole roof in aluminum. This is just so that when I put the fiberglass on it, it doesn't stick to the actual roof itself and I can actually remove it later on. And once the whole roof was covered in aluminum foil, then I just cut a piece of fiberglass and then put it over the roof. And once the whole roof was covered with fiberglass cloth, the next part was to actually put the resin on it. So I just mixed a whole bunch of resin and just dumped it on the fiberglass. And later I used a paintbrush to spread it all over the place. I had to be quick at this because the resin starts setting in about 30 minutes. So I had to pretty much do all this in 30 minutes. Once the whole roof was covered in resin, then the next part was to actually put the foam over it. After putting the foam, I used some tape just to secure the foam in place, just so it doesn't move around. And once both the pieces of foam were in place, I used some weights. Basically, I put the weights over the foam so that the foam would actually stick to the fiberglass itself. This was really important to make sure that the foam was sticking to the fiberglass. Once this was done, I had to give it about 24 hours to set. So it's the next day now, and the roof is looking pretty good for the most part. The fiberglass has cured and hardened, but the only thing that didn't go well is that the extra resin came up through that gap over there. I'll need to sand all that extra resin down before I can put another layer of carbon fiber on top of this foam. But it does look good. It's taken a nice shape, like it does look like the shape of the roof. So after this I had to do a bunch of sanding just to level everything for the next layer to go on, the carbon fiber layer to go on top of this. And after quite a bit of sanding, once everything was leveled, I just took the carbon fiber cloth and just wrapped the whole thing with carbon fiber. So it was basically a repeat of what I did yesterday, but with carbon fiber this time. And after this I just soaked the carbon fiber with resin. And then I had to wait another 24 hours for this resin to cure, and once this was cured I just simply lifted the whole thing off. And because this whole thing was molded on a layer of aluminum foil, it was really easy to just lift the whole thing off. So now that I have the roof made, the next part is going to be cutting the excess carbon fiber off. So I'm just left with the shape I need. Cutting carbon fiber is my least favorite part because when you cut it, dust flies everywhere. That's why I was wearing that helmet and gloves and everything, just to keep away from the dust. But once all the excess carbon fiber was cut off, this is what the roof looked like. And it fitted nicely onto the card later on. But now that the roof was done, I had to get to the other part of removing the actual glass roof from the car, the panoramic roof. Removing the front two glass panels turned out to be really easy because I had removed the sunroof mechanism at an earlier date. So now all I had to do was just remove a few bolts and the whole front two glass panels just came off. But the glass panel at the back turned out to be a real pain. That was glued in place just like most windshields or other windows are glued in place. But the glue was really tough and it was really hard to reach, so I had to work my way with the reciprocating saw for several hours to actually get that off. But midway I just decided to screw it and hit it with a hammer and actually break the glass. But even that didn't work out because even hitting it so hard with the sledgehammer, this glass just wouldn't break. So I had to end up doing it the hard way, just removing the glue and actually taking the glass panel off. And eventually I did get it off after removing all the glue. So after finally getting the glass roof off, I've just put the new roof on just to test fit it. But now I have to take it back off again because I need to make that roof scope that's gonna go on the roof. But yeah, fits on pretty well, so that's good. So as it turns out, I still didn't make that roof scope, but what I did do after that was that I screwed the roof in place. The final time I'm going to put it on, I'm going to take it off once more. I'm going to seal the whole thing with silicone and then put it back on because it's not a perfect seal right now. And I made this duct at the back. This is just a temporary duct. The final duct I want to make the top part out of acrylic glass just so I can have some rear visibility. Right now I've just made it out of cardboard. So there's no rear visibility at all right now. The rear view mirror is pretty much useless. Oh, I do get asked a lot why I went with turbos rather than just the regular mods of putting a smaller supercharger pulley or upgrading the supercharger. And well, the main reason is that when you look at the dyno sheets from all these cars, they make a lot of torque low down in their RPM range. But the problem is that the torque really quickly starts to drop off after like 4,500 RPM. And the problem is for a time attack car, that's really all the RPM band you're using from 4,500 to 6,500 RPM. That's where the engine always stays at when it's on the track. So you're never using that low end torque that the supercharger provides. The benefit of turbos is that you can actually vary the boost according to RPM. So when the engine starts struggling for air, you can actually give it more boost and fill in those gaps where the torque is falling. So you can have your optimum torque all along the RPM range. So because you're always using that high RPM band, that's where you can actually tune the turbos to run their best, and you can get a lot more potential out of the same engine by using that. So for a time attack car, it's going to be a really big benefit. So that's pretty much it for this video. The next part is obviously going to be tuning the car and seeing how much more power I can make out of it. But the problem is it is now pretty close to winter here in Canada, so I might have to wait till next season till that happens. But I am pretty excited for that because that's really the fun part when you actually see everything working and see how much potential you can get out of it. So yeah, I guess you guys will probably find out whatever happens. Thanks for watching and hopefully see you in the next part.